Good morning, all. Welcome. Welcome to the Police Services Board meeting of March 22nd. Today's meeting will begin with the Section 10 Caledon OPP quarterly meeting, and we would like to welcome Inspector Carruthers from the OPP Caledon Detachment. And I might say you were, and your whole troop was well seen with all the work that you did in Caledon and Bolton with all those unfortunate flooding circumstances. So job well done. Thank you. Please proceed.
Sorry about that. It's going on for about 3 days there. So, yeah, so everything's getting back to normal. And, but yeah, it was quite the flood there during that area.
Thank you. Now, I will continue on. We refer now to the OPP Caledon agenda. Roll call. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Seeing none. Approval of the minutes. Do I have a mover? Mayor Crombie, seconded by Louise. All those in favor? That is carried. Inspector Carruthers, if you could provide us now with the overview of the 2018 fourth quarter statistics that we have before us. Please proceed.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Through the quarter of October 2018 to December 2018, on our public complaints, we had 5 conduct complaints. For over the entire year, for the amount of vehicles we stop, we did approximately 20,000 vehicle stops, and all the charges that we laid and all the criminal charges, our complaints are very, very minimal in Caledon. I'm very proud that our officers that are stopping the vehicles are conducting themselves in a professional manner, and that's certainly relevant on the feedback of the amount of complaints that I don't get at the detachment. Our motor vehicle collision types or incidents or fatals, we're down 2017 to 2018. We're down 62.5% in our fatals. We had 8 in 2017, and we had 3 in 2018. And that's certainly trying to align with the Region Appeal Vision Zero Road Safety Strategic Plan. And we certainly concentrate on our Big Four. And with our traffic team, with the visibility they do out there every day, is certainly showing in the stats that I'm getting back. And to go down from 8 to 3 is certainly significant. Certainly proud of our officers for being out there. Our personal injury accidents went down 2.1%. Property damage collisions went up 6.2%. The next slide there is our criminal code provincial charges laid. Highway Traffic Act charges 2018, we had 18,000. We had a 2.6% increase in our traffic charges. Criminal code charges were down 37%. Criminal code non-traffic was down 25%. Other violations were down 20%. For a total of all our violations from 2017 comparable were down by 2.4%. And our violent crime, our total, we were up 2.1%. Our homicides went up 1 in 2018. Other offenses causing death, we didn't have any. Attempted murder, sexual assaults, and assaults are all relatively same. Sexual assaults went up by 21.7%. Assaults went down by 7%. Robberies went down by 40%, and other crimes against persons went up by 31.6%. Our property crime, basically from a 2017 to a 2018, is basically a difference of just 1%. So our drug crime, possession, traffic, and importation, that went totally down by 41.5%. If you have any questions on any of these areas, please, I'm open.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Inspector Carruthers at this time? Seeing none, can I have a mover for receipt of the report? It's been moved by Norma, seconded by Ron Chatha. All those in favor? That is carried. This concludes. Anything further?
Yeah, I just add one more thing, Chair. We did a community survey last year, and I just want to advise the board that out of that community survey, 98.7% of the respondents in Caledon felt very safe or safe in their community. 94.4% of respondents were very satisfied or satisfied with the quality of police service provided by the OPP. And again, that gives us a reflection of what the community opinion is on the job that we're doing in that community from a public safety point of view. So I'm very proud that the figures came back the way they did.
And rightly so. Thank you. Thank you very much, Inspector Carruthers. This concludes the Section 10 Caledon OPP agenda, and we thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you.
That brings me to the public board agenda. We will now begin the Peel Police Regional Board meeting of March 22nd. Before we move to roll call, I'd like to welcome our newest board member, Mr. Ron Chatha, to his first board meeting. And before I take the roll call, Ron, I'd like to welcome you formally. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm not a politician yet.
You're better off.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ron Chatta. I live in Brampton. My office is in Mississauga. So I work with Children's Aid Foundation for a few years, City of Brampton, and willing to just do my part with the community. And I have my family in Brampton, my wife and 2 kids. And it's an honor to be here on this board and working with all these great individuals and my colleagues on the board, and looking forward to working with this amazing board and especially with the chair. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. With that, I go to roll call, and I see all members are present and duly noted. With that, are there any declarations of conflict of interest from any of the members? Seeing none, approval of the minutes of the meeting held Friday, January 18th, 2019. Any questions? Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Louise and Mayor Crombie, first and seconded. All those in favor of the agenda and the minutes? That is carried. Board members' questions and announcements. We now move to board member questions and or announcements. Do any members of the board have comments, questions, or announcements? Seeing none. Deputations. We will now move on to deputations. A reminder that deputations will be limited to 5 minutes in length in accordance with the board's procedures policy. I will alert you when there is about 1 minute to go. Our first deputation for today is by Ms. Laura Zilny from Hope 24/7. Ms. Zilny, welcome. Please come forward.
There we go.
Welcome, and please proceed.
Thank you very much. I'm here from Hope 24/7. We're a regional trauma agency as well as the Region Appeals Sexual Assault Center. I don't know if you can see this, but I can't. There we go. So I thought I'd just share a little bit about what we do so you can become familiar, and then discuss some of the ways that we could partner a little bit better. We've been around a long time, since 1993. We're a professional organization, so all of the employees are regulated health professionals, and we work from a trauma-informed, evidence-based perspective. So unlike other sexual assault centers across the province, we work with all gender expressions and identifications, and we work with folks who are 12 years of age and older. Some of the things that are of relevance to this group would be we're also a fixed harm reduction site. So individuals can come and get a series of supplies, including naloxone, from Monday to Friday. We also have partnered with the Region of Peel, and we offer the Healthy Sexuality Clinic within our own clinic. So Thursday afternoons, the nurse comes, and she works not just with our clients, but it's also a publicly accessible clinic as well. And then we also have another very unique feature, in that we've partnered with a social enterprise so that our service users can access psychiatric services. So if you know anything about trauma, a lot of times individuals need some support in terms of medication to stabilize. And so we have this partnership, and what that has done is taken away the 10 to 12 month wait, and our service users can now get to a psychiatrist within 2 weeks. We are a highly successful organization with success rates and efficacy rates for all of our programs well above benchmark, and we have a very strong satisfaction rating as well. And this gives you kind of the complexity of the service users that we see. Generally speaking, we see around 5,000 individuals. Last year, we saw almost 6,800 individuals. We're a small organization, the second lowest funded SAC in the province. We get 34 cents per capita. But when you look in terms of the complexity of clients, 95% come with a mental health diagnosis. That's why we are all professional staff. 72% have been assaulted multiple times. The average is 4. 36% have been hospitalized at least once. The average hospitalizations for our service users are 3. So you're looking at approximately $20,000 per hospitalization. And 33% of our service users self-medicate. That's why we're a harm reduction site, so we can assist with that. So some of the things that this group could help with is, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Unfounded series that was covered in the Globe and Mail, and work has been done to bring those numbers more into alignment with where it should be. 2 to 8% of all claims are considered false. But there has been a little bit of a consequence in terms of lowering the unfounded rates, and that's in the past approximately 2 months, we've had 7 service users come our way and say, police are not taking the reports of their sexual assaults. So this is a big issue. This has been both in schools, 3 middle and high schools this has occurred in, and with 4 adults. And the comments has been, it's going to be challenging to win. So why go through the stress? So this is an issue that I just wanted to flag because we know that only 5% of folks are reporting anyway. So this is a small group, and if we're discouraging that small group, that becomes a problem. We're working with the police services to become a third-party reporting site because we see the vast majority of sexual assault survivors in the region compared to any other organization. We'd like to be able to participate in that for those, that 95% who doesn't want to report but still wants the perpetrator flagged for public safety reasons. And there's also a real inconsistency in terms of the experience that our service users are saying. Special Victims Unit seems to have really positive service experiences. However, if individuals are reporting to frontline officers, that tends to be where the issues are arising in terms of the not wanting to fill out the paperwork for the report, some negative comments, stereotypes about women and sexuality, etc. And then the other piece I wanted to flag is that since the government has taken power this past summer, our funding has dropped 21.5%. So we had been guaranteed some monies through a contract. Unfortunately, the contract wasn't signed before the writ was dropped, so we weren't one of those organizations that got the money flowing to us. So we're working with them, but there's lots of people with great influence that can advocate on our behalf. So those are the 4 things that I just wanted to kind of flag for your attention, and things that we're keeping top of mind for Hope 24/7. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions at this time? Oh, it refers to seat 11. So, Mayor Crombie.
Thank you. Laura, pleasure to meet you. I wasn't familiar with your organization. Where are you based?
We're actually in Brampton at 10 Gillingham Drive, so the corner of Main and Bovard, and we're Unit 305.
Okay. And so your funding was largely provincial?
Correct.
And it's been significantly reduced?
Yes. So we get $459,000 a year from the Ministry of the Attorney General. That was to have increased to $585,000. Unfortunately, that was clawed back, and so now we're back to the $459,000 to deal with the 1.4 million residents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there any opportunities for you to apply elsewhere? Is there funding at the region of Peel? I don't know. But we should think about that. Where?
Yes, and we apply through the sustainability grants through the community investment program through the region of Peel. Unfortunately, our funding was dropped 18% the last go round, but we definitely will be applying.
No, there are so many worthy groups. That's the problem. Just a couple of questions. One for you, one for Chief. So the naloxone, only available 5 days a week. Wouldn't we make that available weekends?
We don't, because of our funding restrictions, we're not open
on
Saturday,
weekends.
Sundays.
Okay.
And that's why.
I guess there are other opportunities to obtain naloxone in other places. So, Chief, this isn't new. We've heard this before about police not taking reports for sexual assaults. In fact, I know someone firsthand who told me the same thing, that her claim wasn't taken seriously, and she told me that it became a he said, she said, and there would be no prospect for conviction. And how do we change that, Chief, going forward?
So what I can say through you, Chair, is we have a very strong partnership with 24/7. Inspector Paul Pogue from our Special Victims Unit meets with you often. I think actually you met just yesterday again. And this is the first time I'm hearing of these complaints. I am not aware of them, but I can assure you that I will look into them, and I will follow up with Inspector Paul Pogue with respect to these complaints. we have made a lot of changes and provided a lot of additional training to our uniformed officers, following up on the unfounded occurrences. It has become part of our regular training moving forward. But I will follow up with the inspector and try and get that information and find out what these incidents are and why they were not taken seriously as you describe them.
There's been a lot of media about the issue as well.
Yes.
So it's not only here, it's everywhere, unfortunately. But we need to find a way that victims who come forward aren't re-victimized when they're told, sorry, unsubstantiated, unfounded, you have no prospect of success. So I mean, I know someone who came to me to say, what do I do? This is what I was told. So it does occur. And the 7 that Laura talked about were high school students?
Yes, three were from middle school, high school, and 4 were adults.
Oh, 4 were adults, but
Again, I don't know the facts of the allegations, so we would need an opportunity to be able to do that. And
it's
get
something we probably need to take a closer look at.
that. We will.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Ms. Nicholson.
Along the same line, I was going to ask, especially about the kids in the school, whether you had met with our senior officers, and now I'm hearing our chief saying that there has been a meeting. So what I'm hoping is that there is more clarification, because it would be very sad if these situations are happening and they're not being looked into. So thank you, Chief, for saying you will follow up on this. We need to hear more that is being done. Sometimes our children are not being heard because of their demographics or anything like that. I work with young people, so I know this can happen. So I am encouraged that there will be further follow-up, and next time we will hear that we're finding more successes, because this is something that will not go away. And when folks are traumatized and they're re-traumatized, that's when you will need more naloxone. Thank you for bringing this forward.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the board? Mayor Brown.
Just to follow up, so this provincial funding that was lost, 21%, have you had any luck trying to get their buy-in? I certainly, some of us in public service, maybe we can help with some of that advocacy. It looks like you're doing incredible work in the community. You look at those that you're serving, we'd hate to see you lose your reach and your ability to help people. Have you had any of the conversations with the province about getting that funding back, and maybe we can help with introductions?
Thank you for the question. Yes, we have had conversations. So the government announced $1 million to be shared among the 42 SACs. That money has not flowed. We have MPPs working on that to try to see what's going on, because April 1st is very, very soon from today. Other than that, the bureaucratic side doesn't know what is happening, because they haven't heard anything, and we have been unable to secure meetings with Carolyn Maroney, who is the Attorney General. So any assistance or introductions you can provide would be much appreciated.
Well, even thinking of the fact that you're helping 95% of your clients live with mental disorders. Supposedly there's $1.9 billion in new funding for mental health assistance. And so the fact that it's not flowing, maybe there's some advocacy we can do on your behalf, and would be happy to assist.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, the chair would like to follow up with a question through to the chief. He's answered, and I appreciate the questioning from Mayor Crombie and Member Nicholson. And I really appreciate your presentation. I appreciate the forthrightness and the directness. In rereading that statement, police encouraging survivors to not report because likelihood of court success. That is very disconcerting, as the mayor said. The chief's responded that that's sort of news to him. We've asked for it to come back, but I think it's so important to all of us, including the chief and the force. Chief, I would ask, and instead of just direction, Madam Mayor, if we could formalize it here today that we would like to see a report back so that the chief can double back, because I'm sure the chief and I, that's unacceptable to us, and we'd better get best practices and understand the state of affairs. So if the mover and the seconder would agree that we should attach a date to that to come back, and the chief, you can tell us when appropriate. That's going to take some time to look into, but I think we need a more fulsome discussion around that to all do better, so to speak. Okay, Madam Mayor, would you accept that? We want the chief to come back definitive, and he'll let us know in terms of a work plan when that might be appropriate. Chief, any comments?
The only other comment would, I think it would be fair also to share it with Ms. Silney as to the results that we report back to the chair.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Chief, thank you very much. So with that, Madam Mayor,
So
Mayor
you want to
Crombie?
put that in a form of a motion in that case so that we can actually, as a board, study the issue a little further as well? So Chief will give us a timeline by maybe the fall that we can have that report come back?
I would think we could have it before the fall. I think we could target the June board meeting.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Very
Thank you,
good.
Chief.
And we'll be inviting you back. Okay, so with that, we have a formal motion that analysis to come back for the late spring, summer meeting before the summer break. And of course, everybody will be invited back to have a more fulsome discussion. That has been moved by Mayor Crombie and Member Nicholson. All those in favor of that motion? That is carried unanimously. With that, can I have a mover and seconder for receipt of the deputation? Mayor Crombie, Member Nicholson, all those in favor? That is carried. Thank you very much for your presentation. We will see you back in June. Our next deputation today is by Ms. Ursula Cooper-Bennett. Welcome, Ursula. How are you? Very good. And I understand you'll be providing a video presentation this morning. I understand. So 6 minutes, 13 seconds is fine. Can somebody just push a button from where you are and we will see? Would you like to make any introductory comments? Okay, very good. So we will proceed with your presentation, please.
I think we have to keep a level playing field for everybody and keep it, so I'm sorry if you're not finished. Maybe at a future time you can come in and finish if you so like.
Maybe at some future date, you can come in and finish if you so like. That was September 22nd, 2017, Chair Yanika, and it's taken until 2019 for entirely unexpected, favorable conditions to present themselves. In January, you, the newly elected chair of the Region of Peel, was also elected chair of the Peel Police Services Board. I'm sure all members know that the board's access to information policy designates the chair of the Peel Police Services Board as head of Freedom of Information. The head is the most important person in the Freedom of Information process. And you, Chair Yanika, designated head means that the decision to release or deny Freedom of Information records rests ultimately with you. And finally, in you, we have a police board chair who has demonstrated that he bottom line gets that integrity and accountability are about doing the right thing.
Point number 2, the Lady of Justice is blind for a reason. It matters not who she judges over. Whether that's your mayor, whether that's my brother, whether that's the local parish priest. And I have to hold that up to my thoughts as well. I'm shocked that anybody in the audience or anyone in this city would put the cost of such an exercise ahead of having to ensure you have integrity and accountability in your political system. Beg your pardon. So to conclude, at the end of the day, I was not elected for my love of the mayor. I was elected to do the right thing.
So, I request full release of Record 1 that Information and Privacy Commissioner Adjudicator Diane Smith ordered be disclosed in her ruling MO 3476 and that I didn't get. In September 2017, when Peel Police released that record to me, the gaps made it blatantly obvious that some of Record 1's contents had been secretly redacted. Most people are familiar with the common way that government records are redacted using black lines. For example, City of Mississauga Corporate Security redact information too, but they use black lines, so their redaction is clear and out in the open. This means that if people want to appeal the redaction to the IPC, they can. By contrast, Peel Police secretly redact. They use whiteout. This can result in suspicious gaps. And if the bottom of a page is redacted using whiteout, the redaction can go entirely undetected. On October 17, 2017, I emailed IPC adjudicator Diane Smith advising her in part, quote, I received the records on time, but there's a problem. Record 1 has almost certainly been tampered with. Redacted. I'm officially making that allegation. Freedom of Information has already confirmed that Peel Police withhold data, doctor statistics, and hide information from the board and the public. It's therefore not at all a stretch to conclude that Peel Police also deleted 4 bullets and related questions in Record 1. You can see that the gaps in Evans' March 26, 2014 series of questions are just wide enough for bullets and text to fit perfectly. I allege that in her March 26, 2014 email, Chief Evans had 4 additional questions she shared exclusively with Deputy Chief McCord, and they've been redacted in white. Finally, I submit that the gaps and the 4 missing questions to McCord are the reason that Peel Police fought so fiercely to prevent Record 1's release. On October 19, 2017, the IPC responded with, quote, Adjudicator Smith has reviewed your concerns as well as the disclosed records. She notes that her copy of Record 1 has the same gaps that you point out in your letter, unquote. Ms. Smith confirming that her copy contained the same gaps suggests that Peel Police secretly redacted Record 1 sometime between September and November 2016 and then sent the censored email to the IPC adjudicator. The Chief's secretly redacted March 26, 2014 email contains the intriguing introductory sentence, quote, I would like someone assigned to look at our PRP 17s, now that's the force's street check forms, so we are prepared, unquote. Then there's the date, March 26, 2014. Just 24 hours before, March 25th, Bonnie Crombie announced that she was running for mayor, therefore challenging Steve Mahoney, and Linda Jeffrey announced her run against Mayor Fennell, a longtime member of the Peel Police Services Board. Did Crombie and Jeffrey announcing their mayoral run the day before trigger "So we are prepared"? And prepared for what? To defend PRP 17s? Street checks? And what could the 4 PRP 17 queries possibly be that would prompt Peel Police, and presumably the chief, to secretly redact those 4 bullet points? And what new lines of inquiry would the contents of the chief's 4 whited out bullet points have prompted that would have helped us understand Peel Police street check practices? As you can see, there are questions, even if the questions are just for me. Finally, I request, Chair Unica, that you, as head of Freedom of Information, do the right thing and help secure the non-redacted full release of Record 1 so that it and all other Peel Police street check Freedom of Information records can be entered into the Region of Peel Council agenda in time for February 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions at this time? Then perhaps if I could, through the chair, through to Ursula. Ursula, you know, you've caught me at my second meeting. I would like to review the file, get some of the background, and perhaps you and I might have a discussion going forward of next steps, just so I can get my head around the issue. I see that it was dealt with appropriately by the board at the time, but you catch me at a bit of a disadvantage that I'm following up on history that goes back as far as 2014. So I think the board would be right to receive the deputation, and perhaps I will reach out to you and you and I might have a further discussion if that's acceptable to you.
Sure.
Okay. Can I have receipt of the, oh, Madam Mayor, you're on the list. I apologize. Mayor Crombie.
Sorry. So, I mean, we all understand that documents often need to be redacted, but it was a list of questions. Can we ask perhaps that we have a second review of why those questions were redacted and if they were of a sensitive nature and what that nature might have been, and take a second look at perhaps releasing that document? All right, may I move that we have a second look at that document and the meaning, the stature, the quality of the nature of the questions posed and how sensitive they were, and maybe with 2 years perspective, well, 4 years perspective, that this can now come forward. Hindsight's 2020. We've got new policies in place, so perhaps we can have another look at releasing this information. May I task you or the chief with that, please?
Let me, through the chief first. Any response, any comments?
Firstly, I don't know if there's anything redacted from that email. I've got no idea, and I can't give you an answer until I have a look and see.
Sure.
So,
If it exists as well, it's still, Chief,
Yes.
but perhaps
It
because
is.
it had been released in partial format to Ms. Kuiper-Bennett, maybe it still is available on some.
And the Privacy Commission
Microfiche.
may already have been provided with the response to that, so I
If
would
we
need
could
time
take
to do
I'm
that.
just going to move that we take a second look at whether that could be released today, given that, some time has passed, and maybe if there had been a redaction, if those issues are still as sensitive as they were then.
Thank you. Any other speakers to that motion? I see that it has been moved by Mayor Crombie and seconded by Mayor Brown. I will take that question now. All those in
You
favor?
got another speaker, I think?
Oh, I'm sorry, and I don't see names, I see numbers. So who is it? Sharon, please, if you'd speak at this time, with my apologies.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment that based on the, and I'm not familiar, again, with the exact record, but based on the Privacy Commissioner Adjudicator's response, I can tell you that their practice and our practice is to provide completely unredacted records to them. The only redactions that we would ever maintain in the version of the records that are provided to them are privileged information. So based on what I've seen, my expectation would be that there's no further redactions, and that the Privacy Commissioner, it appears, has agreed with that and already responded to it. I'm completely content to go back and review the file, but based on what's there wouldn't be any further redactions.
Very good, but I think that reconfirmation would make some sense. Any other speakers to the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. Ursula, thank you. All right, our next presentation, our last presentation, is Mr. Joseph Kuss, but I don't know if he is in attendance. Mr. Joseph Kuss, you're listed as a deputant. Last call. Seeing no one, I then go to presentations, item 4. Our first presentation today is from the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, or CCDI, who will be presenting their final equity audit report. And I understand Mr. Michael Bach is here to present. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for allowing me to come and present today. It is a pleasure to join you. Before I begin my presentation, I just, for those of you who are new, want to give you some perspective on who we are as an organization. So the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion is a national educational charity with the mandate of educating Canadians on the value of diversity and inclusion. We do that in a number of ways, including in-person events here in Peel Region. But we also own and operate a social enterprise called CCDI Consulting, which was the organization that was engaged as part of this work. It provides consulting services in diversity and inclusion to organizations such as the Peel Police. A little bit about this engagement. We were engaged in May 2017 by the Services Board with the objective of reviewing a number of things, including hiring practices, race relations, promotional practices, anti-discrimination policies, employment equity, diversity, gender issues, and officer misconduct procedures and policies. Subsequently, we were also engaged to provide an environmental scan of other police services doing comparable work, and as well a public consultation. One important note, and this is in the report that you, I believe, all have had access to, is that there have been a number of leadership changes, both in the police services as well as the regional board. There is a section on leadership in the report. However, some of that will no longer be accurate as a consequence. So in my presentation today, I'm not going to speak to that. My one thing I will tell you is I don't want you to then discount the rest of the report. There's a great deal of finding in here from your own people, from the service members within the police, and that's what you should take to heart. In terms of our methodology, this is a methodology that's been developed and delivered with over 100 organizations in Canada. It involves two pieces: first, assessment and coaching, followed by measurement and analytics, and then we conduct an analysis and strategy. And that is embedded with standard project management, as well as a significant focus on information security and information technology. Under assessment and coaching, we had 3 work packages as part of this engagement. Leadership growth, which was leadership interviews, one-on-one interviews with every member of the services board, as well as the police service. Workforce growth, where we conducted a documentary review of several hundred policies that the service has. And then community growth, which is public town hall consultations and a public survey. Under measurement and analytics, where the bulk of the work occurred, we had the census and inclusion survey, which was run with all members of the police services, and our culture meter work package, which included IDI, or intercultural development inventory assessments of all of the leaders, and focus groups with specific demographic groups within the service. In terms of some of the numbers around the diversity meter, we had an overall participation rate of 59.32%, of which 69.97% were sworn officers and 29.98% were civilians. The participation rate is definitely an acceptable one. Usually, industry standard is about 70% that we look for, but from a diversity and inclusion perspective, we look for 60%. So we're quite happy with that result. Demographic questions, there were a total of 35 potential questions, including a free text question where people could provide any form of comment that they liked. However, not every person got all 35 questions. So there were questions, as an example, if you identified as living with a disability, you would then receive 3 subsequent questions. So it wasn't everybody that got the 35 questions. And the inclusion questions, we had 12 in total using what's called the Likert scale. And that's where you have a response from strongly agree down to strongly disagree. But every question, including the demographic questions, had a choose not to answer option, as is in keeping with privacy laws in Canada. Once we get into the analysis and strategy development, we also had an industry meter work package, which included a media scan, a literature review, and a benchmarking study where we looked at other police services across the country doing similar work. The methodology is developed to include a significant number of data points from different stakeholder groups with the objective of coming up with the most complete picture that we can of how things are operating inside the organization. It includes both quantitative and qualitative results, as well as internal and external stakeholder groups. And it provides cross-validation. Nothing you will see in the report is a one-off. There is nothing in the report that was one person's comment. We always look for groupings. The report also, I should point out, brings up what we deem to be noteworthy, things of concern. It does not include all of the data collected because it's already 140-something pages and we didn't want it to be that much longer. But you are able to access your data, the raw data files as needed to conduct any other analysis that you'd like. Today's presentation, I'm going to focus on just some highlights, some things that I would like to raise to the board in terms of things that you should pay attention to. I'm not going to go into all of the details of every finding in the report, but just the highlights. So in terms of key findings, finding 2.1 and 2.2 from the report speak to the opportunities that we identified as part of the documentary review to increase the effectiveness of execution of policies, as well as addressing inclusion in the service. There are a number of findings that you will find in the report related to this, so I'm not going to focus on it too much, but I think it is an excellent opportunity, a quick hit, if you will, for the services to do better with their policies and get some efficiencies there. From a demographic representation perspective, what we found is that the Peel Police is lower in representation in 3 specific groups, those being racialized persons, newcomers, and women, compared to the Peel region as a whole. So as you see in the slide, the racialized respondents were 24.8% in comparison to 62.26% of Peel region. Newcomers at 21.02 in comparison to 51.49, and women at 33.02 compared to 50.81. All other areas were either in line or exceeded representation. This is just a thing. The one thing about representation is it just is. There isn't a good or a bad, but it is something that as a service you should be concerned about. You should be focused on. You should be representative of the communities that you choose to serve. From an inclusion perspective, there's more opportunity. What we found was that there were low positive response rates for half or 6 of the 12 questions, which suggest low feelings of inclusion by a portion of the workforce. And I'll show you those questions now. My organization, at my organization, my unique value is known and appreciated at a positive response rate of 48.42. And I should point out that when I speak about positive response rate or positive sentiment, that's people that answered either strongly agree or agree. A neutral response is those that answered slightly agree or slightly disagree, and a negative response is those that selected disagree or strongly disagree. At my organization, I feel included at 59.27. Senior leaders of Peel Regional Police support measures to increase fairness and respect at 50.14%. I am aware that I can request a flexible work option at Peel Regional Police, 48.81%. And at Peel Regional Police, I have confidence that we're building a more inclusive workplace at 57%. It is also worth noting that while we look at the benchmark of 60%, the industry standard is 70%. But we, again, because of the questions that we're asking, we have assigned a lower benchmark, but you do have questions that are in between the 60 and 70%. We also note that racialized persons have a higher negative response rate to inclusion questions compared to Caucasian respondents, and I'm going to point out 3 questions where there is a significant difference. So to the question my organization is committed to and supportive of diversity, you will see that the Caucasian negative response rate was at 3.75 in comparison to the Black respondents at 17.65% and Asians at 16.13%. Of course, conversely, we have a positive response rate of 81.16% for Caucasians and 43.53 for Blacks, 54.84 for Asians, which were the largest 2 racialized populations of all racialized respondents. To the question at Peel Regional Police, I have confidence that we're building a more inclusive workplace. Again, Caucasian negative response rate of 9.79 and Black respondent at 21.18, so over twice the negative response rate. To the question at Peel Regional Police, everyone benefits from equal access to resources and opportunities. The negative response rate for Caucasians at 17.46 in comparison to Blacks at 30.59%. In terms of feelings of inclusion, again, we identified a perception of favoritism in processes at Peel Region, and there are 3 data points that I'll refer to. 8% of the free text comments as part of the diversity meter discussed perceptions of favoritism in processes and individual bias. To the question at Peel Regional Police, everyone benefits from equal access to resources and opportunities. We saw a positive sentiment of 50.3, so that was again at agree and strongly agree. So again, we've got half the population not agreeing with that question. And lastly, less than a quarter of respondents, or 24% of the culture meter focus group participants, had a positive response to the question about fairness and consistency in applying for jobs and promotion. So more than 3/4 of respondents saw a negative response there. Conversely, some employees perceive that they believe reverse discrimination is present based on their identity. The largest percentage of comments, 31.55% of comments, discuss the perception that diversity, equity, and inclusion is creating discrimination against socially advantaged groups, specifically Caucasian men. They also perceive that employees of minority groups are not as qualified for their jobs and are receiving special advantage. We tend to see this in organizations that are not necessarily doing a good enough job in communicating about the priorities and the experiences of the other. So in the Peel Police, there may be instances where officers, sworn members, are not fully aware of the experiences of their racialized counterparts. Most employees in the focus groups had either witnessed or experienced harassment and discrimination in the workplace. 79% indicated that they had experienced harassment or discrimination themselves, and 90% stated that they had witnessed harassment or discrimination within the Peel Regional Police. Further, that is supported by findings 2.14 and 2.15 regarding reprisals and retaliation for reporting harassment and discrimination, and that members of the focus groups heard and witnessed homophobic, sexist, and anti-immigrant language. Respondents had indicated that the option to report is generally not considered for fear of reprisal. Individuals indicated that they might be marked or harassed even further by peers and, in fact, supervisors and managers. Respondents cited that racist, sexist, bullying, and homophobic language is being used towards peers. Some respondents stated that when this takes place, they don't feel like they can report it because in some cases, the offender is actually in a more senior position. And many indicated that there was no safe escalation channel. Some employees do not share the positive perceptions of leaders with respect to fairness, consistency, and equal opportunity. And I present to you the response to 2 questions, and you'll see that the findings in blue were the responses from Peel Regional Police leaders and service board members, and the responses in red are from the employees, the sworn members, and the civilians. To the question, Peel Regional Police managers, inspectors, directors, superintendents, supervisors, sergeants, assistant managers, staff sergeants apply policies consistently and fairly. There was a strong belief by leadership, 24% strongly agreed and 52% agreed with that statement, in comparison to 28% that strongly disagreed with that statement. So there is an imbalance there amongst the employees of the Peel Regional Police in comparison to leadership. And to the question, everyone is treated fairly and consistently when applying for a job or promotion at Peel Regional Police. Again, we saw 41% of leadership strongly agreeing and 21% agreeing, in comparison to 28% strongly disagreeing and 14% disagreeing. There is a divide between the understanding of leadership and about the lived experience of employees within the Peel Regional Police as it relates to racism, sexism, and homophobia. And this is supported by the comments that came from the one-on-one interviews with the leadership, and then also from the free text comments as part of the diversity meter, and from the comments that came out of focus groups. And I'm not going to go into them because they take up about 4 pages of the report, so there's quite an extensive set of evidence there. And with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Thank you. Perhaps I can start, if I could. I'd like to say a few words on behalf of the board, with first of all thanking you, Mr. Bach, for your presentation and for the work that's gone into preparing it. I've read this report cover to cover twice now, and I accept the conclusions of this report and its recommendations. This is a sobering look at the work we have to do as a police force and as a community. While issues of systemic racism are universal, when it comes to policing in the region of Peel, we must hold ourselves to the highest possible standard. We can always do better when it comes to diversity and inclusion. We now have this roadmap to do just that, including some specific recommendations that speak to increased training for diversity, equity, and inclusion, increase accountability mechanisms, including the development of a zero-tolerance policy, and expand our community advisory group to include more demographic groups. As a board, our next steps must be to involve acting on the accountability measures identified in this report. And as the board chair, I intend to work with the interim chief and our 2 associations on a plan to implement these recommendations. I would also like to recognize the work that our officers and civilians do every day. The board recognizes the pressure they are under every day, and they will continue to have our unwavering support. With that, before I go to any questions or comments, I think it appropriate if the chief might like to make a comment. Chief?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Michael, and I know you're joined today with Angeline. Thank you very much. First of all, in your opening remarks, I agree with you that this report does provide us great value, so thank you. I've reviewed the report also, like the Chair. It is extensive, but clearly says we need to continue to grow as a police service with respect to inclusivity to keep pace with the rapidly changing community. We know Peel Regional Police is one of the most diverse communities in Canada, something we value. Our recruiters are working diligently to ensure we reflect the community we serve, and we have made great progress. We have nearly 1,000 employees who speak 60 different languages. In 2018, 61% of our officers and cadets that we hired were racialized, as were 54% of our civilian employees. Our aim is to use the findings in this report to make us a best-in-class police agency. In the report, CCDI acknowledges Peel Regional Police has put in place many of the right kinds of messages, initiatives and processes across aspects of policing as an employer and in the community, and these efforts are recognised in several different ways by employees and members of the community. However, we recognise there is a lot of work ahead of us. We will support our leaders and employees by enhancing their cultural competencies, and that is very important. I emphasise that. We will use tools such as Deloitte's 6 signature traits of inclusive leaders to develop our leaders. Hiring an equity and inclusion specialist will allow us to apply the inclusivity lens to our hiring practices, our policies, our promotions and transfers, to name a few. I am confident the recommendations in the report are things we can achieve through authentic inclusion. In closing, I would like to thank the board, our employees and members of the community for their participation and candid feedback during CCDI's review. I assure you, we have heard you. There is room for improvement, and Peel Regional Police will be better because of your input. We will provide the board with regular updates as we do this, Chair. Thank you.
Chief, thank you. Comments, questions at this time from the board? Mayor Crombie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chief. I thought it was important that I spoke because I moved the motion for the audit a couple of years ago and wanted to give you some perspective on why I did so. But let me also acknowledge the comments of the chair. I think he chose the right word to say it was very sobering to see the results, and I too fully accept the conclusions. And the good news is we have a set of recommendations from you and a path, a strategic path forward, a roadmap, if you will, on how to accomplish some of the very key findings and overcome some of these issues and challenges. I called for the audit initially because I think that I truly feel that systematic racism occurs everywhere. In my organization, in Peel Police, in every corporation. And to be aware of it and how it occurs is the best way to defend yourself and to address it and to overcome the systematic bias and racism that exists. I also wanted to benchmark ourselves against other forces to ensure that we are, as the chair said, of the highest standards, which is incumbent on us to set ourselves and to meet the highest standards that are in place for other police services. And I wanted to be sure, of course, that we're working towards greater diversity, greater inclusivity, to ensure that our police force reflected the wonderful diversity that is my city of Mississauga, of course, and the region of Peel, because we are wonderfully diverse. And I know that my city is 56% born abroad, and Mayor Brown's perhaps even more so. But mostly, I also wanted to benchmark ourselves against other forces, and perhaps we can do a survey if other forces have performed such audits and where they are, but that's sort of irrelevant now because we've highlighted where the challenges are, and we have recommendations to move forward. And I'm delighted that the chief has said he accepts the report's findings and the recommendations, and they're going to put a plan in place. We already have a plan on how we move forward. You've accepted the diversity officer that will sit in and be accountable directly to the chief right in his office. If I may say a couple other issues on the training front, that we will enhance training for everyone, anti-racism training. And I'll let you know that even here at Peel Region, our counselors. There was an incident, I don't want to raise it, last year, and we all undertook sensitivity training, and it helped everyone. I think it just highlights those issues and how to better cope with them, how to better deal with them. So we all took the training, and I think we're all better people for it, because you can always do better, right? And in terms of accountability, I think you've recommended a zero tolerance to racism, and of course we accept that, but how do you implement that, right? We need to develop new accountability mechanisms, and I know the chief is going, and his team are going to work closely on that. And then thirdly, on greater community input. So certainly at the City of Mississauga, our council wasn't very diverse when I was first elected mayor, but I wanted the voices of the communities to be heard, so we created the Diversity Inclusion Advisory Committee, we call it DIAC, and it's gone a long way to helping us look through a lens of greater diversity and inclusivity, so we raise issues, and we've actually formulated new policies at the city as a result of recommendations from DIAC. Now, former chief did have community advisory committees, and I know that the Chief McCord will also expand those groups and ensure that we're always looking towards, with that lens of diversity, of all the needs of all our citizens are being met. And I will say that, you know, there is a South Asian group, I think both Muslim, Sikh, LGBTQ, youth, Black advisory. I see Lyndon King here, who is part of that group. So they do great work at advising the chief, but we have to step it up, I think, as well. And, you know, listen further, because clearly we have work to do. So I don't have questions other than just to say that I agree the right word was sobering. Thank you, Chair, for that. And we do know we have a lot of work to do, but we're prepared to do it. So thank you, Chief. We have recommendations and we're going to move forward. So I'm glad I called for the audit and know where we stand, and we're going to work hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Crombie. Ms. Nicholson.
I just want to say thank you for the report. And of course, there's lots of work to be done. And as Mayor Crombie says, I want to acknowledge Lyndon King. He is the chair of our Black Advisory, and even our board, looking at our board's diversity. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers? Mayor Brown.
Thank you, Chair, and to echo the comments of Mayor Crombie, I think the words of the Chief and you yourself, Chair, that it's sobering and that you want to accept the recommendations immediately, I think it absolutely is the right direction. The recommendations on training, on accountability, on community input, I think are the right path forward. And just to say, you look at Peel Region, and boy, has it changed over the years. We are the world in Peel Region, and we all know we have to do better on diversity and inclusion, and hopefully this report is the spark for that to happen. And, you know, Mayor Crombie mentioned about diversity in Mississauga. At Brampton City Hall, we're actually now seeing that for the first time on our city council. And I'll mention an initiative the Brampton Fire Force did. They realized that despite the city being so diverse, that the fire force wasn't. And so as an attempt to get racialized communities involved in firefighting, they've now been running weekend fire academies where they go out to community groups to talk about how to get into firefighting. And it's the take-up has been huge. And so there are interesting ways to engage communities in a field and a profession, and I would say that that's another thing that we could look at as well. I think that model has worked well with Brampton Fire. I would just close by saying we've all read this report word for word, and I wanted to say we're grateful for it. I wasn't here when Mayor Crombie called for this audit, but we're out there at community events, and we certainly hear about it. And the fact that we're finally taking action, I believe, is long overdue, and I think will be appreciated in the community. So thank you for your hard work.
Thank you, Mayor
Oh,
Brown.
and one question, sorry, I made a note of this. The participation. I remember reading that the participation was 30% in the civilian and closer to 60% in the sworn officers. Was that the participation of the sample size, or was that the participation of the entire force?
Thank you. Yeah, it was the participation of the sample size. So of the 60% that participated,
And what was the sample size?
the entire service.
Oh, the entire service.
The
Okay,
entire
great.
service, yeah.
That's all, Mr. Brown? Thank you, Mayor. With that, if I have no other speakers, Mayor Crombie has moved it. Mayor Patrick Brown has seconded receipt of the report. All those in favor? That is carried unanimously, with thanks to you and your organization, Mr. Bach, for your work on the file. Thank you very, very much. With that, our next two presentations, the first deals with the Amber Alert and the second one deals with 911. I'd like to introduce them, if I could, as chair. As you know, there was a lot of media attention paid to the Amber Alert that occurred in Peel just recently, which ultimately ended in the tragic loss of a young life. As a result of the media attention, I asked the chief for this in the second report following the presentations, as I've seen this issue as a teachable moment for all of us on these important issues. And I'm grateful the chief thought this was an opportunity. So with that, we will have report 5 and then questions in report 6, first on the Amber Alert program and then on the 911 system. Chief, over to you, and who you will be introducing as presenting on, firstly, the Amber Alert program.
Thank you very much, Chair. So today, Inspector Martin Ottaway has joined us to do this presentation. It is very timely because just a couple of nights ago we had the other Amber Alert in York Region. So Inspector Ottaway will take you through the process. Inspector Ottaway is the inspector in charge of our Homicide Bureau. That was where the investigative teams came from to investigate the death of little Rhea and then her father's passing away as well. So it is very timely, and I'll hand it over to you, Martin. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to take you through a quick presentation just to give you some background on the Amber Alert program and how it works. So it's in basic terms, it's a warning system that quickly alerts the public of an abducted child that may be in danger. It's a provincially administrated program that the OPP runs, and it's been active in Ontario since 2003. The main objective of the Amber Alert program is for the safe return of a child. The early stages of an investigation are critical, and the information obtained quickly through Amber Alerts may assist in the safe and swift return of a child. Once an Amber Alert is received from a police service to the OPP duty office will send out details of an alert to participating Amber Alert partners, which I'll get into coming up. And it's broadcast via program interruptions in 20-minute intervals. So Amber Alert information is sent out to cable and satellite companies, radio, TV stations, video on demand services, wireless networks, and also through some participating social media. So the guidelines that we follow when it comes to issuing an Amber Alert is displayed there. So we have to, number one, the child has to be under 18 years of age and has been abducted. We believe that the child is in danger and that there's descriptive information for one or more of the three issues there, which including the abductor, the vehicle involved, or the child. This slide goes into the decision flow chart that is looked at when making decisions on whether or not a police service is going to issue an Amber Alert through the OPP. For if it was Peel Police and the investigation leads to the point where we feel an Amber Alert is necessary, the investigator will fill out a request for an Amber Alert form with all the pertinent details. This form is reviewed either by a CIB inspector or by the on-duty duty inspector. Once that is approved, the request is then sent to the OPP Provincial Operations Center. Once the OPP receive that letter, the OPP Provincial Operations Center inspector will review the request to ensure that it meets all the required points to meet the criteria of an Amber Alert. If the criteria is met, then the Amber Alert is approved and is then launched. The way they launch it, it's through a system called the NAD, which is a National Alert Aggregation and Dissemination System. And this provides the secure delivery of the alert message to participating partners in this program, as I said before, like television, radio, cable, satellite, wireless providers. So an Amber Alert will go live for 5 hours, and you can add a one-time extension of 2 hours if it's required. As well, the suspect, victim, and vehicle descriptors are also sent to our CPIC unit that's added to the program, or system. So I added this slide just to put some things in perspective about how rare actual Amber Alerts are issued. So as you will see, over the last 5 years, there's 829 missing children reports taken by Peel Police. And the next slide I'll get into, you see that there's only 4 occasions since 2003 when the program was started that we've actually issued an Amber Alert. Of those 4 Amber Alerts that we had in Peel, 2 are parental abductions that both resulted in the safe return of the children and charges laid. The third one was a reported kidnapping, which after investigation we determined to be unfounded, and the person who made that report was charged with public mischief. And then the last, of course, which is already the chair's commented on, was the murder of Riya Rajkumar. That's a basic background for you into the Amber Alert program and how it works. And any questions anyone has, I'd love to answer.
Any questions from the board? Mayor Crombie.
You gotta learn my number.
Yeah.
I'm number 11. Thank you for this. And I know, Chair, that you had asked for this report, and it was very timely given that we've had 2 Amber Alerts, serious ones in the past 4 or 5 weeks. On the matter of Riya Rajkumar, I had the opportunity to attend her visitation, and very tragic case. And then how did the Amber Alert, maybe I should be asking the Chief, lead you to find the father? What was the timeline that occurred, if you may say, if it's most of it's public?
Absolutely. I can tell you. So at first, when her mother reported the incident to it, and Marty referred to this of CIB, that's our criminal investigations officers. They take carriage of an investigation such as this. So it was brought to their, when it was initially brought to their attention, the information that they were provided that the father had, with consent of the mother, was out with Riya on that day.
On her birthday,
and
it was mother's
okay.
birthday.
It was that everything was fine. And Priya, her mother, never had any real concerns until she was contacted just after supper time by Ria's father to say that he planned on doing harm to himself and to Riya. That's when her mother came to us and reported it. Initially, the information was that her father and Riya were together in the car. And we used many investigative techniques to try and track them, and we had been tracking them. We had information that they were going to the movies, and we had already been to one of the movie theaters, conducted a full search in that movie theater. We had officers at the father's home and posted there should they return, because they were out in the vehicle together. The car was not at the residence at the time. So all investigative avenues were exhausted at that time, and then there was a decision made, because they were mobile, and we had information that indicated that they were traveling eastbound on the 401, to release the Amber Alert. Mm-hmm. We contacted the OPP. The OPP released the Amber Alert, and when they did, It was at approximately 11:30 in the evening.
Yeah.
5 minutes later, a motorist saw the car and the license plate.
Thankfully.
And then they alerted the OPP.
Right.
And the OPP stopped the car between Barrie and Orillia. And the father was arrested. Unfortunately, at that time, Rhea was not in the car. Prior to that, the decision was made because we had investigative information to suggest that they may not be together. We entered the residence and found Rhea.
And at that time, he had harm to himself as well.
Yes.
Well, that was great police work. It was just a very, very tragic situation. And I just want to make a statement about the reports we read about people calling in to 911 and calling in and complaining to the police and to ourselves at the city as well. I want to say, what if it were your child, for goodness sakes? How callous, how self-centered can people be? How cold-hearted? I'm sorry if it took you away from your hockey game or 10 minutes sleep, a child's life is in danger. So I'm just really appreciative of the great policing that you apprehended this individual in just such a tragic situation. A little girl and her mother actually lived in Mississauga. It was the father who lived in Brampton. I want to thank Mayor Brown, who organized a vigil that I was able to attend because I wasn't able to attend the one in Mississauga, but it was a very tragic situation. And now there was another one this week in Markham?
Yes, in York region.
York
Yes.
region. And the father was arrested as well, so it worked. However, later released. So it was sort of misinformation. What had happened in that case?
I'm sorry, I don't know the background of the investigation in that one.
You know the
Yeah,
facts.
I'm not aware of the details either and what's taken place, other than they obviously had some information of concern at first, which is why the Amber Alert was issued, so.
Right. Well, it works. We're very grateful for the tool. And people, just think about it. If it were your child, would you want people calling and complaining? Goodness grief. How callous. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Brown.
In a similar vein as Mayor Crombie, I think the chief's words were very appropriate at the time. I think 99.9% of the public appreciates the Amber Alert system, and for the people that called in to complain, we don't need to pay attention to the jerks that don't appreciate what is an integral service for our community. And so there may have been some phone calls that evening, but what I saw was an outpouring of support for the Amber Alerts and an actual anger towards those that would have had the nerve to call and complain and tie up our lines.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? The one that I have, and in referring it to the chief, first of all, as you quite rightly point out, it isn't Peel Regional Police, but it's Peel Regional in conjunction with the OPP that call the Amber Alert. So some were quick to criticize us, but then you realize there's a format that one has to go through, and you've spoken to that. Here's my bigger question on behalf of the board and for all citizens. You've shown the data that clearly demonstrates that when people think there is a perceived abduction, 99, almost 0.9% of the time, it ends up not being so. That must be an enormous burden to weigh the, let's say the sky is falling every time. Let's just, if there were 100 incidents, let's just do it all 100 times to be safe. Then, of course, you run the fear that it's just the same old background noise and no one pays attention. I'd love the chief and the staff to speak to that, what you're trying to balance, in other words.
I can add, there's lots of layers of approval and issuing an Amber Alert, and I think that, like I talked about, even with the OPP, when they receive Amber Alert forms from other police services, that they even have an inspector that reviews the criteria before they issue it. The fear is if you issue Amber Alerts too often, then people just stop paying attention to it, which defeats the whole purpose of the program. But when you look at, since this program has been in effect since 2003, we've only had 4 since 2003, and you look at how many missing persons cases are involved, that we look deeply in them before we take that step of issuing an Amber Alert.
Thank you, Chief.
If I could also say, Chair, that, okay, 99% of the time it's not necessary, but you know something? If we can save one child, it's all worth it. All the hours, all the efforts that's put into it, every bit of that effort and all that time is worth it to save one child, and I wish we could have saved Rhea.
Well said, Chief. Okay, if there are no other questioners, Madam Mayor, we'll move receipt of the report, seconded by Ms. Mitchell. All those in favor? That is carried. That brings us to the second component. Our third presentation today is from Peel Regional Police on the misuse of the 911 system. Chief, would you like to introduce the presenters, please?
So our presenters are Superintendent Don Kuzno and Inspector Joe Paolini. So both of the officers are in charge of our Communications Bureau, and that is where the 911 calls come in. And the reason for this presentation is somewhat a follow-up to the Amber Alert and the calls we received, but also to highlight the amount of abuse there is for the 911 system. And I will hand it over to Superintendent Kuzno.
Thank you, Chief. Please proceed.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the misuse of 911 in our region. By way of background, 911 came to Peel Region in the late 80s, and since that time, the Peel Regional Police Communications Center has been designated as the region's PSAP, or Public Safety Answering Point. And what that simply means is that every time a call to 911 is made in the region, the call will go to the Communications Center and first be answered by a Peel Regional Police call taker. Now, the slide in front of you shows some statistics as far as our call taking and calls into the Communications Center over the past years, and I think we all know that over the past several decades there's been some significant growth of the region's population, and that growth has resulted in some fairly significant growth in our calls for service into the comm center. In 2018, we received a record number of calls in, that's total calls in, at just over 709,000. And of those calls, over 430,000 of them came through on the 911 system. And what's of great concern is that of those 911 calls, well over a third, over 182,000 calls, were deemed to be a misuse of the 911 system. And when I say misuse, I'm simply referring to a call made on 911 in a circumstance where it's not an emergency. And so we'd like to play just a couple short clips. I would describe these as everyday examples of some of the misuse calls that our communicators deal with.
911, do you need police, fire, or ambulance?
Police, please.
Where do you need the police?
This is Sagar Road and Field.
And
Traffic.
okay, what's going on there?
Well, the thing is, to be honest, I paid for a car wash and I'm not getting the money back, and I don't know exactly what I can do.
Okay.
Just to come back tomorrow.
Sir, this is not a life-threatening emergency. You need to call in on the non-emergency line. Hello, do you need police, fire, or ambulance?
Yeah, please, I need a police, please.
Where do you need the police?
It's yes, ma'am.
Okay, just give me a moment here.
Thank you.
What's going on?
I'm at the laundromat. I came to do laundry,
Yeah?
but the machine is not working properly, and my clothes was not properly washed, and I tried to dry, the machine is not working properly. And
Okay, ma'am?
anything.
Sir, this isn't a life-threatening emergency.
So when you look at those types of calls and break it down, we received over 500 calls every day last year similar to that. And you can appreciate the added pressures it puts on our workload of our call takers when they're dealing with over 1/3 of 911 calls being calls that shouldn't be coming in the first place. This next slide demonstrates some of the reasons behind the significant increases in our 911 calls and misuse calls. We refer to these as NAC, or no answer queue calls, and these are quite simply just calls of very short duration where there's no voice on the other end of the line for the operator. Typically, this will be a call that usually someone realizes they made a mistake and they hang up. And it requires our call takers to take steps to try and locate a phone number for the device, and then make efforts to try and phone back until they can satisfy themselves that nothing's wrong. And as you can see, last year, that required our call takers to make out an extra 81,678 calls. These are in addition to the calls already coming in, just to follow up with these NAQ calls. So I think we can all appreciate the additional workload that is caused to staff by these misuse calls. But what's of greater concern is the risk to public safety that's posed when we spend over a third of our time on misuse calls, and particularly during peak periods, peak call volume times. We know there are legitimate 911 calls that are being delayed in being answered. Now, we recently had a well-publicized misuse of the 911 system as a result of an Amber Alert last month, and it resulted in a number of misuse calls. I'm going to ask Inspector Joe Pialini, who's the officer in charge of the Communications Center, to speak a little bit more about that. And he's also going to touch on some of the things that the Communications Center is doing to try and combat the issue of misuse.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thanks, Superintendent. February 14th was somewhat of a unique Amber Alert. I mean, this is a time when we are asking the public to call 911. So we put out the Amber Alert and we're asking them to call 911. So I'm going to play a couple of clips here that, I don't know why they're not showing up here, that will show that and let you hear some of the ones that actually came in that day. Oh, sorry. That's yours, right? No, it's not. Oh, there we go here. Okay.
911, you need police, fire, ambulance.
Hold on, let me put my phone on speaker so I can hear you and you can hear me. Brother?
Oh, okay, but do you need the police, fire, or ambulance?
Hold on, man, hold on. I just got an Amber Alert text message. That's my first time getting it. I don't know what's going on. It says, I want to know what's going on.
Oh, okay, do you have any information related to this?
No, I don't know any.
Now 911, you need police, fire, ambulance.
I got an Amber Alert right now. Saying that an 11-year-old got stolen. Is it real? I got an my Apple iPhone saying that an 11-year-old got stolen and it's please to call 911. Is it real?
So, I mean, those are a couple of the mild ones that our call takers were exposed to. Unfortunately, they were also exposed to a tirade of profanity, personal attacks. And some of these call takers themselves were young mothers themselves, so it was disturbing for them. So we see that. Now, when you see the stats, there was obviously a spike in calls in 2019, and during that 2-hour period, out of the 208 calls that we received, 43% were deemed inappropriate calls in relation to the 911. So again, as Superintendent Kuzno touched on, we've got call takers that are trying to get through these calls to actually get to ones that may have been some relevance where we need to offer assistance to the public. So it was very frustrating for the call takers, but my hats are off to them. They were very professional, and we didn't receive any complaints from members of the public of how they were handled. So that was a positive for us. Now moving forward onto our proposed direction, I think Madam Mayor spoke about this earlier in York Region. They had one on Tuesday, March 19th at 5:17. That Amber Alert generated approximately 20 to 25 calls to our 911 communication center, which wasn't too bad. It wasn't overwhelming for our call takers, but it created about 50 calls to our switchboard from the time that the Amber Alert went out on the Tuesday through to Wednesday of people calling to complain and asking who they could complain to. I spoke to my colleague in York, who said that they had about 150 calls in an hour period in relation to their Amber Alert, and their call takers were subjected to the exact same things that ours were. Of further notice, their chief's office received about 100 calls the following day complaining about the Amber Alert and the fact that the individual was released without any charges. So the chief's office took quite a few phone calls there. Moving forward from this, what we see is this isn't just a problem in Peel, it's also a problem across the province, and I've spoken to a lot of the other inspectors in charge of communications across the province. So this is a continual process of educating the public. In 2018, we had a 911 awareness campaign in which had somewhat of a success in making headway, but we've seen now that we have to continue to keep going forward. And I think what we have to include in that is also educating about Amber Alerts. We're going to start looking at that and including that in some of our presentations. We have a 911 awareness group committee made up of communicators that volunteer to go out to the public and to various community events and speak about 911 awareness. And actually a few of them that are on the committee have actually asked about addressing Amber Alerts as well. So I think we're going to be doing that. And I think we can make an impact on the week of April 14th. We're going to be working closely with our media relations. That's 911 Awareness Week, National Communicators Appreciation Week. And we're going to use that week there to make the public aware of 911 and Amber Alerts and things of that nature using our corporate communications. That's it from Superintendent and I, if anybody has any questions.
Very good. I have seat 16, but I'm not sure who is asked to. Oh, sorry, myself. Tells you how far behind I am. My apologies to all. When I normally sit in this chair as regional chair, the system works much differently. We name us according to our seats. So, okay, if I'm on the list, my apologies. I must tell you, and thank you so much, and this is why I've asked for the report. I am dumbfounded after 31 years in public office at how incredibly self-absorbed and brain-dead people can be. So number one, you are self-absorbed, and why are you bothering me? And then to pick up the phone and call 911. Those are two separate acts, right? Oh my gosh. And in my 31 years, what I've told constituents is, you can't really argue with them. They just have to buy their own private island because they don't commune with the rest of us. I'm being deadly serious to have gotten this call, and mothers with children and others phoning, why are you bothering me? Are you kidding me? In the one most recent time that I recall it, how many times has it really happened? It bothered my wife immensely too. She didn't sleep all night because of the child. Oh my God, what's happened? Because we're normal human beings. And then to compound it by saying, let me get on 911 and give those people a piece of my mind. Are you kidding me? So the point that I wanted to make as chair was, regrettably, every now and then you get a teachable moment that speaks for itself. This is an opportunity that we can say, as opposed to what might happen and please don't, here's what happened. Here's the incident and why we did it. Here's what the repercussions were on 911. I think we have no choice but to rally far and wide and get this message out, because this is a teachable moment with practical data that instead of a hypothetical, here's what happened. Here was the response on the part of some. Because to think that 1/3 of our calls are 911 or nonsense, it's just unacceptable. And so that's why I, as chair, said this has got to come back, and I would hope the board would agree, and you've touched upon it, that we go to town on this. Because this really happened. This is the real data. This is how some people responded. And so through to the chief and from the board, I think you go to town on an awareness campaign highlighting the actual incident and the actual data. And I think you're telling us that that is the next step forward, and I'm sure the board endorses that fully. Do I have any other speakers from the board? Mayor Crombie.
Scene 11. I sure do miss Chair Unica's silvered rhetoric at Mississauga Council, so glad to have you here as well. So I was going to say the same thing, but in much simpler terms. Not only to teach people about 911 awareness, but on non-emergencies, how to call through to the police station, not to complain about your laundry or the car wash, but if you have, information that would be useful to the police that isn't of an urgent nature, how do they make that call to their local division? But I think it'd be informative to use some of those comments people made in the campaign and how inappropriate they really are, and how people have lost sight of the point, which is that a child is missing. It could have been yours, and we can save a life tonight with your help. So yes, I think we all support your campaign, Chief, but also to teach people to call through to their local division, not 911 in non-emergencies, right? Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. Ms. Nicholson.
Thank you for providing the service that you do. I just want to make a comment in that I do support the Awareness Week, and I know through the chief you will develop different methods of taking this message forward, suggesting that we bear in mind that in the region of Peel, we have diverse cultures, we have newcomers, We have folks who are not even able to read or write. They don't know where to call. It could be a refugee that just came to Mississauga or Brampton yesterday. Could be the first time they're using the washing machine. And I so admire the communication staff on the way they handle the situation. So just a suggestion that when the awareness is done, I know it costs money, but if we could have information in different languages, different levels, flyers, because people learn so differently. So you may come and speak to me, and I don't fully understand except if I go away with a little piece of paper that maybe my granddaughter can read to me and I can understand it more. So please include those people. I hesitate to say they're dumb or they're silly. They just don't have the resources. And when they see that we are saying we want to teach them, we want them to be inclusive. We want diversity, but that must include inclusion. So I look forward to seeing some of those pamphlets when I'm out in the community, and I know you will do this because you have been doing such a great job. But to decrease these numbers, we need to reach people at a different level. Sometimes there could be someone with a mental illness. They don't know what to do. Cognitively, they just remember 911. So there's the opportunity for many teachable moments. Thank you.
Thank you, Norma, and your point's well made. With that, Norma, if you'd move receipt of the report and the direction that you've outlined, as well as Mayor Bonnie Crombie, who will second it. Are there any other speakers to that? All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you very much. With that, that brings us to our final presentation today, which is from the Peel Regional Police on the Comprehensive Ontario Police Services Act. Chief, would you like to introduce the presenters on this file?
So thank you, Chair. Actually, we've asked General Counsel Sharon Wilmot to do the presentation on this. If I could just point out that this Act has only gone through second reading. There has been a committee to review the Act and allow submissions before it goes to third reading. So just if I can highlight the fact that this isn't finalised yet, so that's why we're really giving a high-level presentation at this time.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chair and Chief. I apologize for rounding out an agenda with a less than exciting presentation for you, but it is an important piece for us, certainly. This piece of legislation has been sort of in a state of uncertainty for the last couple of years, and it's starting to look like we may have some more concrete idea of where we're moving forward with the legislation. So in keeping with the Chief's caveat, this is not final, but we have seen a good view into what we can expect in coming months under the new legislation that we'll be operating under. So I just am going to provide a brief update on the status of the legislation, and then I'm going to hit on a couple of the very, very high points as to what I see will affect us going forward the most. So this was introduced by the government on February 19th. So it's gone through first and second reading. It was then referred to, as the Chief said, the Standing Committee on Justice, where they've had two full days of review. They've accepted a number of submissions from a number of stakeholders, including the Association of Police Services Board, a number of the police associations, the Police Association of Ontario and the Senior Officers Association. So they've also done a line-by-line review, and they've just recently released an updated version that will be going forward for third reading. I've taken a glance at it. It's not incorporated into this presentation because it's moving forward. But what I can say is that there's not a lot of significant changes from what we've seen, as far as I can tell, some minor tweaking. So I think that we have a good idea of the general gist of the legislation. They're also in the process of drafting a number of the regulations. So as you know from the current Police Services Act, a number of the details are found in the regulations, and we haven't seen those yet. So we have an overview of what's going to happen, but we're awaiting anxiously the regulations to see how things will actually operationally work. So some of the highlights that I have pointed out in the report that was provided to you are to do with the Police Service Board's obligations, which continue in a very similar manner. Some details are fleshed out a little bit more carefully in the actual body of the Act. The duties of the chief and the police officers and how an officer is appointed will be changing. The oversight provisions will include a fairly fundamental overhaul from what we have seen in past, but it's very similar to what the predecessor government had introduced in the Safer Ontario Act. The Safer Ontario Act 2018 will be repealed by this legislation once it receives royal assent, but what will happen immediately is that while we're in a transition period to make the changes that we need to make in order to be in compliance with this new Comprehensive Ontario Police Services Act, we will revert back to our previous Police Services Act of 2007. So it will be sort of operations as usual until these come into effect. I also am just going to touch very briefly on some of the changes with the complaint system, oversight, and conduct investigations and the chief's duties in that area. So there's some small changes, such as the police services boards will now be police service boards, which seems like a very minor and inconsequential change, but it will result in us having to change numerous things across the board in order to get rid of that S. And then you'll recall from the Safer Ontario Act, there were provisions aimed at privatization of certain policing functions. Those provisions are still in this version of the Act as we see it now, subject, of course, to the fact that it will all be detailed out in regulations. We also see a little bit more detail into the separation between operational and policy decisions for board members, how meetings are determined to be confidential and not confidential. All of those details are just outlined a little bit in more detail in this version of the Act. So when we're looking at the duties of the chief and the officers, police officers will now, rather than simply be employees of the service, similar again to the Safer Ontario Act, the predecessor act, they will operate by way of appointment by the board. So a board will have, similar to how we currently appoint special constables, the board will appoint the police officer as an officer, and that appointment would be terminated immediately in a number of situations, including if the officer is no longer employed by a police service. We also have some changes to the oversight bodies. So as you know, following Justice Michael Tulloch's report, there was question about how our oversight and policing should look. What appears to be the intention of this government is that the Ontario Civilian Police Commission, which currently operates as an appellate body as well as a first-level investigative body for certain types of conduct, will be dissolved, and many of its functions will be transferred over to a new office called the Inspector General's Office. The Inspector General will take over responsibility for management of complaints regarding board members, adequacy and effectiveness of policing, compliance with the Act, policies and procedure complaints established by services. Similar to, again, the Safer Ontario Act, the Ontario Independent Police Review Director will have another acronym that people will not remember as well, which is the Law Enforcement Complaints Agency, LECA, it will now be instead of OIPRD. That agency continues essentially as the same with a director as well, and they will retain jurisdiction over all public complaints. The primary difference with LICA is that they will complete their investigations, and then they will turn over any findings of misconduct completely to the chief, and then the chief within a service will have independent discretion to determine how to deal with those things. Outside of a situation where a chief wants to demote or terminate a police officer within the service, and in those cases, and I'll touch on this in a little bit more detail, in those cases, there will be an independent roster of adjudicators, and they can only do so by having a hearing before those independent adjudicators, which is important for the board to be aware of, because the boards will be responsible to pay for those hearings through the roster. Again, the roster is referred to in the legislation. It will fall under the Ontario Police Arbitration and Adjudication Committee, but we don't know what the roster will look like, who will form those hearing officers. But essentially, it will be self-funded by the service of origin where the officer is coming from. The Special Investigations Unit will primarily remain intact as it is. There will be a new piece of legislation, but it will not cover special constables or auxiliary officers, as the Safer Ontario Act had proposed to do at one point. It will largely stay the same, with a somewhat increased focus on reducing the timeline of investigations down to a 120-day timeline. The community safety and well-being plans continues as is already outlined in the Police Services Act. Municipalities, along with all of the stakeholders, will continue to be responsible for developing a community safety and well-being plan. The primary difference is that now in this piece of legislation, the chief is a mandated member of those well-being planning teams, which is an important distinction that we had raised previously. And then finally, the adjudications, discipline, suspension without pay, all of those issues which have sort of been hotly discussed in the media. Many of them stay the same. The sort of nuts and bolts of how disciplinary hearings are going to be held are sort of fundamentally going to change in a way that it looks like hopefully it will speed up and make them more efficient, and make the chief's ability to deal with day-to-day matters of discipline in a more efficient way. Suspension without pay. As everybody knows, this has been a major issue in the media, and it's an often discussed issue as different versions of this legislation have come out. So there's now two further categories under which an officer may be suspended without pay. So in the current act, an officer can be suspended administratively, but with pay, unless the officer is convicted of an offense and actually has some sort of custodial sentence. So in addition, now there is going to be provisions so that if an officer is on judicial interim release or a bail condition that fundamentally interferes with the officer's ability to perform his duties, there can be a suspension without pay. And also, if the officer is charged with an off-duty serious criminal offense, again, we don't know what the seriousness, how that will be outlined. It'll be in the regulations, but those are some sort of more palatable changes that we can see in that portion of the act. So the next step for the legislation, I understand that it has gone through the standing committee. They have now posted their revisions based on those consultations and the review that they did. It's been referred back for third reading once that takes place, it will receive assent and will come into effect presumably in the near future. I think the fundamental takeaway point for the service is that we've been preparing for this for, unfortunately, many years. It's come, it's gone. We've seen different versions. Fortunately, I think this version of the Act is not all that different from the last version, and we have already been working towards coming up with ways that we can be compliant and preparing for the expected changes that are coming. So I don't think that this is going to take us that off track for what we've already been preparing for.
Thank you. We have questions at this time. Mayor Crombie.
Figured out that I'm seat 11. Thank you. The analysis was really great, and I'd say the one thing that I thought was a great addition was the diversity plan, and that was very timely for us given the audit that we'd just been through. But at the same time, really just really a lot of minor tinkering to make rebranding, OCPC, now the IGO, and OIPRD, the LECA, etc. My question to you was, hopefully we can deplete the stationery, but before we drop the S and order new ones. Yeah.
And the signs.
And signs, yeah. How many of Justice Michael Tulloch's recommendations made it into the new legislation?
Well, I think the spirit of his recommendations were followed to the extent of the oversight. I think there was an attempt by legislators to try and simplify the oversight bodies. That being said, I think when you really look at it, we still have a number of different bodies that are acting in different ways, and it's still sort of a segmented approach to oversight. Was
that the key recommendation Justice Tulloch made? Simplification of the oversight bodies?
Yeah, and it's not to say that by the fact that the oversight is being conducted by different offices that it's not going to be simplified. And again, that's something that probably remains to be seen in the regulations and how those bodies will actually operate. Fundamentally, I think the oversight provisions, the way complaints are accepted, reviewed, and dealt with is not going to change in a very extensive way. I think one of his recommendations was to try to focus on reducing timelines and getting things done in a more efficient way. And I do think that the way that the Act is written right now, I think that there's a focus on that, which was probably taken directly from that recommendation, as well as, the stakeholders putting forward concerns about timelines, efficiency, how we move forward operationally in the face of all of the oversight.
And he also, I think, made recommendations on sort of the racial profiling of people on the streets as well, and there's been no movement on that.
There's nothing specific in the legislation as to some of the code of conduct. So following Michael Tulloch's, he's done 2 reviews, obviously, and following the review on street checks, there have been some changes to the code of conduct, which presumably will remain the same. We haven't seen, again, the regulation is where we see the code of conduct. We can assume that they won't be making fundamental changes to the code of conduct, but we haven't seen that yet. That's sort of where you would flesh out any of the specifics on how we deal with allegations of systemic racism. I think by looking at the focus that's sort of weaved throughout the Act on all levels, municipalities, police services boards, chiefs, officers, there's clearly a focus in the Act on diversity. Boards are mandated to consider diversity when they're looking at appointments. There's diversity plans. All of that is clearly a general focus in the Act, which I think is a fundamental change from the 2007 version, which was clearly outdated and did need updating.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no other questioners, I'll thank you for your presentation, Ms. Wilmot. It has been moved for receipt by Ms. Nicholson and Mr. Chatha. All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried unanimously. With that, that brings us to the end of our agenda for the public portion of the meeting. What I'm going to suggest now is we will adjourn till 12 sharp, so 10 minutes if we want to take a break, and then we'll conclude with the in-camera portion of our meeting. With,
Do we want to just adjourn really quickly instead?
do you want to just carry on, everyone? I didn't know if anybody wanted, we'll just clear the room and carry on? If okay, we'll carry right along. So thank you very much for all that did attend, and we will just keep moving along. Thank you.